Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. In the book of Psalms, we're in the section where there are many songs of ascents, as we talked about in previous devotions. And these are the songs that most likely the Israelites would sing as they made the ascent to Jerusalem. And the section that we're in, more specifically within this section, is the section that they would have sung while they were in Jerusalem. We already looked at Psalm 120 and 120, which was their desire to go to Jerusalem. Psalm 121 was them beginning or embarking on the journey. And then Psalm 122 was kind of like an introduction when they would have first stepped foot in the gates of Jerusalem. And many psalms fall within this category of songs that they would have sang while in the city. Matter of fact, Psalm 122 through 131 fill this section. And as we look at each one of these psalms within this section, that is the section of the songs that they would have sang in the city, each one of them teaches us and would have taught them and reminded them of various aspects of God. After Psalm 122, which is kind of an introductory psalm, in Psalm 123, they would have sang about God's favor. In Psalm 124, God's help. In Psalm 125, God's protection. In Psalm 126, that we'll talk about more in a moment, God's redemption, or we could say restoration. Psalm 127, God's stability and security. Psalm 128, God's blessing. Psalm 129, God's justice. Psalm 130, God's forgiveness. And then Psalm 131 is kind of a conclusion of them all, in which the psalmist just desires the Lord himself, not the blessings, not anything else, just the Lord. And maybe we'll be able to cover that psalm when we get there. But for now, we want to look at Psalm 126. That focuses on God's redemption or God's restoration. And this is a psalm that would have been written after, most likely after the exile to Babylon, and then their return back into the land, because they rejoice over the fact that they were able to go back to Jerusalem in verses 1 through 3, where it says, "When the Lord brought back the captive ones of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter and our tongue with joyful shouting. And then they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us. We are glad." So they said we are like those who dream. Maybe talking about the time when people enter into the joy and the ecstasy that comes from a good, pleasant dream. Or, given the historical context, they might have been talking about a dream like a vision, like a prophetic vision. We're like the people who receive a prophetic vision. That is, we got to see the Lord and experience the Lord in a very special way. And it says our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongue was joyful shouting. Just a joyful time when they were able to return back to Jerusalem after being away from it for so long. However, when you get to verses 4 through 6, something changes. Apparently, they're remembering back to the time when they went back to Jerusalem and they had that joyful experience, but are now experiencing a difficult time. And if you're familiar with the history of Israel, that certainly happened. King Cyrus did allow them to go back into the land and go back to Jerusalem, and even made a law that they could rebuild Jerusalem. But as they were there, they encountered various enemies, various difficulties and setbacks. And so these verses would have applied to those people, but it could apply to many other people and can apply to us as well. But it says, "Restore our captivity, O Lord, as the streams in the south." And there's probably talking about the dry wadis that were dry there in the south. But once it rained, they filled up really fast, and a big torrent would come. And it didn't last long, but when it was there, it was very forceful, and they would fill up really quickly. And what they're asking for here is that the Lord would do the same thing for them, They desired a sudden experience of the blessings of God in a very overwhelming way. He says, restore our captivity as the streams in the south. And then he says, those who sow in tears shall reap with joyful shouting. And going into more detail, it says, he who goes to and fro weeping, carrying his bag of seed, shall indeed come again with a shout of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. Just a beautiful metaphor here. But what it's borrowing off of is the idea of a sower who back in that day probably did sow his seed in sorrow, because there was a lot of worry and anxiety that came with sowing a field because of the fact that you were uncertain about getting the right kind of rain at the right times. You would have been concerned about whether or not your crop would suffer disease or some other type of thing that would cause your crop to fail. And so as they're sowing their seed, it wasn't necessarily a joyful time. It was actually an anxious time. But the harvest was always seen as a joyful time. He said those who sowed the seed while they were weeping, they were going to reap a harvest. They were going to come again with a shout of joy, bringing the sheaves with them. And this reminds us of Galatians chapter 6 in verse 9, where it says, let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. Just like those sowers back then who were sowing the seed and didn't really know what would come of it, or if anything would come of it, so we too sometimes are laboring for the Lord, and we encounter difficulty and hardship and trials. And we begin to wonder, is this seed that I'm sowing ever going to produce a crop? Is the seed that I'm sowing ever going to have any type of benefit or profit? And each and every day, maybe we encounter this. We wake up not really sure if our labors for the Lord are really going to make a difference and really bring in any good fruit for the Lord. But each and every day we just go out faithfully, just like the sower had to do. Maybe he wasn't joyful, maybe he wasn't always happy doing it, but he went out and he sowed the seed and was faithful in sowing the seed. And then when the harvest came, he could reap not only the harvest, but also reap the joy connected to the harvest. And the same thing is true with us. As each and every day we're just faithful to the Lord, even though it might be hard, even though it might be difficult, even though we might do it with tears in our eyes, we just keep sowing seed for the Lord. And eventually we will reap the joy that comes with the harvest. Eventually we will see the fruits of our labor and recognize that our labor is not in vain. As 1 Corinthians chapter 15 says in verse 58, therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your toil is not in vain in the Lord. And there it's in the context of the resurrection. Because the resurrection is coming, we know our labor is not in vain. We know that we don't just work here on the earth and die and then that's it. We know that the resurrection is coming. Eternal life will be experienced in a very real way, and we will reap the harvest of our labor. So he says, or he's not saying don't, he's actually saying to be steadfast, be immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. So as we read Psalm 126 today in our reading, let's be encouraged to keep on sowing the seed, even through the difficulty and the hardship. We don't have to doubt whether it's going to produce anything good. We know that our labors are not in vain in the Lord. So these are some things to think about as we do our reading today. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.